Mafia, the Old Country, transports us to early 1900s Sicily, in a much overdue original entry to the Mafia series. And my god, have I been enjoying it. If you exclude the remake of Mafia 1 and the remasters, Mafia the Old Country is the first entry to the series we've had since 2016. And that of course was when we got Mafia 3, which was a bit of a mixed bag. Now to me, Mafia 3 was not an awful game. I really enjoyed Lincoln Clay's story, but a huge chunk of the gameplay contents felt incredibly shallow. Above all else, it was an unnecessarily bloated experience. It may have supported an acceptable gameplay loop and a narrative that wasn't the worst thing I'd ever experienced, but it diluted itself in a tsunami of meaningless vague objectives, and that made it tricky to digest and appreciate what it had done right. Then in 2020 we got Mafia Definitive Edition, the remake of Mafia 1 from 2002, and I think it's fair to say it boasts a fantastically told story, albeit it clings to the isms of a game from 2002, and that's a double-edged sword. Mafia the Old Country is the first objectively new Mafia game in almost a decade, and naturally of course with it being a newly released title, you're likely here wanting to know if it's any good. And to answer that question straight up, yes. But the Old Country isn't just good. Dare I say it, it's great. I fired it up on release day imagining I'd sink a couple of hours into it here and there until it was finished and then do a video. However, after a couple of hours had passed, I found myself cracking open the alcohol-free beers and becoming so involved in the story and gameplay on display that suddenly there was no story left. And I know it kind of comes with the territory as to what I do for a living. Finishing games is kind of second nature to me, but for a game to make me committed to doing so in one long sitting, it speaks both to the quality of the game and the refreshing nature of it. But is the Old Country flawless? Of course it isn't. It does have areas where it could have done with being better, but in my opinion those issues are considerably outweighed by a wash of positives. So stick around for today's review and I shall go through the lot. Now to start off with, I do want to talk about the story a little bit. Now I know it's a new game, so I'm going to avoid spoilers to the best of my ability and keep my talking points as vague as possible. However, I'm going to issue this warning because it's very hard to gauge what people's tolerance for discussing story in these early days is. So what I'd consider to just be establishing the premise of the story could be a spoiler to somebody, and the last thing I want doing one of these videos is one of you showing up somewhere in my life and killing me because I ruined your life by telling you about a slight plot thing in a game that you are yet to play. And so with that cleared up, in Mafia the Old Country we play as Enzo Favara, a young miner, not that kind Keir, leave me alone, living a life of indentured labour. It's a hard life in conditions akin to slavery, a life Enzo and his friend Gaetano bid to flee, to get away from the abuses inflicted by the foreman, and to actually live for themselves rather than somebody else. Naturally, events transpire that oust our new protagonist from this monotonous lifestyle, as you'd expect, because the game's called Mafia and not mining, with Enzo being forced to flee, which leads him towards the Teresi crime family, where he's taken in and put to work in the family's vineyards. Over time, he earns trust and goodwill through hard work and an unflappable level-headed demeanour that seems quite predictable of Mafia protagonists, and yeah, it goes from there. I'd say the plot overall is classic for a mob story and follows that general routine of Act 1 prioritising crawling out of the shit, Act 2 being all about shit going good, and Act 3 being where the shit goes wrong, but being well put together, coherent, with likeable and equally reprehensible characters, all serving a valuable function, tends to make that acceptable. The cutscenes are incredibly cinematic, combining well-composed shots with the game's overall stunning visuals, and the narrative is made very clearly the priority. The gameplay is filled with missable details and collectibles that flesh out this world. The music and sound design is impeccable. It's really hard to come up with anything original to say with regards to it without delving into spoiler territory, so I shan't waste too long on it. But overall, I really enjoyed Mafia the Old Country story. It may be a slash on the predictable side for big chunks, but predictable narratives at the very least tend to be reliable. We get good character work, dialogue with genuine gravitas, the appearances of certain characters you may recognise from other entries to the series, but not so often as to become overindulgent in fan service. You know, where it stops servicing the fans at all, and the story somehow develops self-awareness of its reused characters' significance to other stories at the expense of this one's authenticity. And we also have an overall well-written narrative piece. Despite the odd thing getting lost in the shuffle here and there, the entire thing is captivating, so finishing the game in one sitting was ultimately because of a desire to see it through, born out of its own quality. The big difference between this Mafia story and previous ones though is its setting, and I don't need to tell you that this isn't set in some fictitious US city where the Mafia is tearing up the streets on the brutally sharp end of the American dream. We're in the old country, Sicily, a landscape largely dominated by picturesque countryside, where we pass villages, villas, vineyards, ancient ruins, and some of the most glorious volcanic scenery going. It's a huge change of pace for a series predominantly oriented towards much more urban settings that makes its world almost refreshing by default in the isolated context of the Mafia series. Sure, you can layer a city more, you can present more visual information in a shorter range, but here you need rolling hills, rivers, waterfalls, rock formations, villages, sporadically placed houses, and endless dirt roads for us to muddy our tires as we go. We need a landscape that is ever beautiful, endlessly glorious, contrasted by more built-up areas such as San Celeste where, though fictional, you can see a much older world on display even still. The world is a strength for the old country. It's a completely different way of life to the previous games. It therefore offers us an overall very different flavour. In equal measure you can understand why there was such an ideation of America amongst Sicilians seeking a better life, and you can comprehend why that was such a massive shame. Because this world Hangar 13 has crafted is utterly stunning at its best. But what I am glad to see above all else is the narrative being this game's main focus. After Mafia 3, the open world game didn't have the strongest argument for where the future of the Mafia franchise should lay. I'm relieved therefore to see a much more linear storytelling approach here. Open world games are hard to pull off properly. Not only do you need to somehow retain a narrative structure, which can sometimes get lost in taking off for hours on end, unless the story pacing is ultra specific to account for this, and in failing that maybe the game's trying to be a bit open plan, allowing you to complete missions in a random assortment of orders, compromising at times on meticulously laid out character work. You also have to fill the world with not just any old content, which many studios seem to fail to realise. Mafia 3 certainly stands as an example. An open world needs content that is actually worth doing, worth prolonging the experience to soak in, and sometimes that isn't adding as much to the game as it first appears, as it's very hard to fill a large world space with content that doesn't get drab and repetitive long before you've done even close to half of it. It's why when an open world game manages to rise above this easy trap, it gets hailed for a very long time. The old country mitigates facing these issues by simply opting not to be an open world game. Like Mafia 1 and 2, the world is there. I suppose you could technically label it open world, but it isn't to be explored. You can take off and explore it at points, and there is a free roam mode if you like soaking in a grossly depopulated world where NPCs partake in basic activities or stare at doors if they even spawn at all, but it's there primarily to immerse us in what we're immediately doing. We pass a convincing world on the way from one objective to the next, or during events where we observe the lives of NPCs in passing. We get to be involved in events that breathe new life into certain places to totally transform the vibe. As we travel from the start of the story to its end point, we're treated to a feast of life from a world that is designed solely to aid the storytelling. Mafia 2 certainly understood this. The old country feels like a vastly different game even to that, but certainly holds that ethos that the world is a character in this story above all else. An open world game besides is a huge risk for any game. The rewards are ultimately higher for a well executed one, there's no arguing any different, but there's an honesty to simply being linear and not risking compromising on quality for the chance at a grander experience for the sake of it. As a result of this honesty, the game isn't unnecessarily long like Mafia 3. It doesn't have the bloat to it that overall cheapened that experience. What it offers is exclusively of a quality that can be consistently sustained, and there's a certain respectability to a 12-hour game that does that over falling in with the homogeny of 50-hour plus AAA massive non-linear open world slogs that seem to have become the standard to varying quality. Not that there isn't a place for them. I also like that the game didn't cost full AAA price at 60, 70, 80 pounds or whatever it is these days. From the PS Store it was 45 pounds, or in CEX talk, 30 second-hand copies of The Green Mile. But you can easily find copies from retailers at sub £40 in the UK, and the game's only days old. The game could easily have passed for the full whack. I'd argue it's worth just as much if that's what inflation has led us to. But I'm damn glad you can get a copy at a price point you don't need to remortgage your house at. Really gets you going from a positive mindset, and the mentality of the player going in absolutely dictates what nonsenses will tolerate the game doing. Mafia, the old country's short, linear delivery ultimately makes it refreshing to see the series fall back in line with the games that established it over the corpulence of Mafia 3. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the same as what came before. On the visual front, however, the old country is utterly stunning. It opts for the realism style that has probably turned game development into a sluggish machine overall, but this game gets a pass because it isn't combining this strive for lifelike visuals with an unnecessarily huge world filled with drab content nobody in their right mind would want to engage with. The visuals here really work for that film feel in the cinematics with the letterbox cutscenes. Now, I'm not a huge fan of letterbox cutscenes in games. If used improperly, it can come across as cheap. But here it's on a level with Red Dead Redemption 2 where it actually feels quite fitting as it draws you into the occasion. Even then I'd probably prefer to not have it, but I can appreciate it as a choice in art direction. It can, however, make transitions between gameplay and cutscenes a slight awkward at certain points, but otherwise it does the job. The lighting is good, if a bit potent, the faces look great, the scenery is sensational. Mafia the Old Country is aesthetically very pleasant, and really brings the experience to life. Now, let's talk gameplay at long last. Gameplay's where the biggest difference, aside from not being open world, is noticed. Mafia the Old Country plays somewhat differently to the other Mafia games. The gunplay feels heavy and takes adjusting to, which is oddly quite good as a touch for a story about a young mobster learning the ropes for the early part of the plot, however unintentional it may have been. There's also a huge stealth focus, which wasn't especially the case for previous games. Sure, Mafia 3 had passable stealth, with Lincoln basically being a one-man army in most scenarios, but here we feel far more mortal. We use stealth as a default option, and we single out our enemies to take down and then choke them out or stab them to death. We avoid conflict where we can and strike from a position of strength when the time comes to break cover. Mafia the Old Country's push for stealthiness isn't absolute. There are instances where we simply have to play the quiet way, so it isn't exactly waiting for the player's opinion on playstyles, but there's an immersive quality to being far more vulnerable than perhaps even in previous games, where you'd be thrust into gunfights every 5 minutes, even if you could die quite easily. The gameplay equipped you better to cope with constantly being in the middle of the action. Here, you're equipped to orbit the action until the action is unavoidable. The stealth is fairly simple. You have a focus mode, as many games like it do, where you can see enemies' locations even through walls, which is imperative for third-person stealth, I'd argue, on account of not actually seeing through the protagonist's eyes, as that can skew you without the ability to see what's around a corner in a room before you fully enter it. Beyond that, you simply avoid the line of sight, keep in cover and take out enemies if you have to. Then you can drag their bodies and drop them in a crate. There are two ways to take out enemies in stealth. You can choke them out, which isn't a given thanks to a reasonably straightforward button mashing event where you have to adequately mash a button before you run out of stamina or get overpowered. Alternatively, for a quicker takedown, you can give them the Slough special with your blade. The knife has durability, so you need to keep it sharp to use it to continuously unlock doors or boxes for loot, so you're constantly engaging with the environment looking for lootable objects, taking out enemies to loot them so you can find whetstone to keep your blade sharp, or ammunition for when confrontations become direct, or bandages to heal yourself. It all works incredibly simply, and it's quite easy to do, which is nice. The enemy patrol patterns are easy to learn, they aren't placed in a slapdash manner that makes the stealth a lottery either. Because of the heavy story emphasis, everything is placed meticulously to make the segments feel balanced and authentic. The only thing I will say is the fact that you can get locked into certain animations at times can throw it. For instance, there was one mission where I was trying to sneak past a couple of cops standing on a hump bridge, so I thought I'd be able to slip behind them under the bridge and wait beneath it for them to move on so I could proceed. However, once I began the animation to move under the bridge, Enzo wouldn't stop and had to complete the animation through to reaching the other side and emerging, where I of course was immediately detected because I was right in front of the Rozzers. That's irritating, but it's such a small thing I suppose, because I thought I was being clever using my logic, only for the game logic to stand squarely in my way. Does Enzo not know how to pause when under a hump bridge? However, once I got my head around what the game would allow me to get away with, I didn't find too many obstructive stealth sequences, and once I figured out the path forward, it all became rather unchallenging. That may be a woe to some, but to me it kinda helped me progress the story at a pacing that allowed me to remember the previous cutscene by the time I got to the next one. Overall, the stealth works reliably, and because of its weightedness, it's satisfying to pull off. And it's quite easy to come to grips with based on how simple the gameplay overall actually is. As for the combat, you have a small assortment of guns, of which you'll only ever be able to carry 2. You can use your knife in combat for more intimate kills, but they expose you, so naturally you'll always be on the lookout for ammo to ensure that when shots get fired, you can fire back. You don't have a lot of health and it doesn't fully replenish itself, but unlike Mafia 2 where you needed food that never showed up outside apartments and shops to heal, which is a fat lot of no help when you're in the middle of a gunfight, here you just need bandages in your inventory and there'll often be an abundance for you to pick up or loot off corpses and stash for when you need them as you go. The shooting itself feels incredibly weighted, as I said before. I mean, the storytelling pacing, despite the length, isn't rapid, so the gameplay occurs at a similar pace. Animations at times feel like they take longer than they need to, but I like that there's an intimacy to lining up a shot and firing. Just like you have to be involved in choking enemies out in stealth, it isn't a given that because you've sprung an attack, it'll be successful. Now, it isn't hard, but the gameplay wants you involved and it wants you to feel the weight of every shot, every slash of your blade, every kill. A lot of games play at a pace where you can sort of mash your way through gunfights and be okay. Here, you can only carry so much ammunition. You have to be careful with your shots. Ammo is far from sparse, but you can only carry so much, so you'll want to end most engagements in as few shots as possible, otherwise things can get messy, which means you can't just thoughtlessly fire countless shots in your enemy's general direction until enough hit to cause death. You have to remain level-headed, aim and time your shots to maximise impact. Otherwise you'll be looting corpses for ammunition in the middle of a fight, and depending on how that's going, that can be quite a gamble. In gunfights, cover is your best friend, because without it you'll be mangled in no time. That makes successful combat encounters more satisfying if you like that. And if not, it's an incentive to cling to stealth wherever you can, but the game often puts you in these scenarios and imposes necessity on stealth, or indeed story events force you into combat. Now, you do get charms that sort of slightly adjust things if needs must, but the benefits are often negligible, so I found myself using them to slightly negate aspects of the gameplay that annoyed me. For instance, animations that took too long. As for boss fights, there are boss fights in this game, and this is where the gameplay does get most notably repetitive, as these are exclusively knife fights. The game has a competent knife fight system where you can slash and stab, dodge and parry, and will need to tap into all of these in most knife fight encounters because they're all the same. The knife fight boss fights do not evolve beyond their establishment. The responsibility of variety rests entirely on the occasion. It feels like every opponent fights the same, and as a result it can be incredibly underwhelming after the first few goes at it. The only differences are the location, therefore the scenery, sometimes the narrative weight of the moment, and of course the character we're fighting. Otherwise, the boss fights really are a missed opportunity for the old country to use these one-on-one duels for throwing in curveballs. What if we fought somebody who had a weapon that was not a knife, like a sword or a hammer, something we had to learn how to respond to? What if we faced 2 enemies at once to put us on the back foot? What if there was an enemy with 2 knives? Or what if we had some fights that were just fist fights rather than the same setup time and time again? I don't want to knock it too hard as it does the job, but there was so much room for variety here, and it just isn't used at all. Don't get me wrong, what is there of these fights? It isn't bad. The general feel of converting man to sushi is satisfying, but it's an area that could have done with considerably more variation. But the repetitive nature isn't exclusive to the knife fights, it's just the most egregious offender. The gameplay overall does get a bit repetitive towards the back end, relying on the set pieces and storytelling to give it a sense of variation to disguise its otherwise simple nature. But I don't mind the simple aspect, and it's not like there aren't some moments of novelty here and there. It's noticeable, but acceptable. The combat and stealth don't do anything to rock the boat. The gameplay does nothing that we'll necessarily be talking about in 5 to 10 years either. It's just a competent, albeit straightforward, gameplay loop. And since the gameplay never strays too far from the value provided by the tight storytelling, it can afford some repetition. Now, on the traversal front, we have 2 options really. We can drive some ye olde cars and they feel weighted, sluggish, and often can't readily accelerate like modern vehicles. They feel tricky to drive, and some have to be cranked externally, which is a nice touch, but when it comes to just hopping in a cart across the map, this doesn't seem to be necessary. Most cars struggle with hills because the engines aren't strong and they handle in a way that feels believable. You have to balance your speed when cornering. You have to use your brakes and handbrake frequently. Remaining in control at high speed is a challenge. Often it's impossible. You'll find yourself on your roof, which is especially disquieting when the car has no roof, but Enzo doesn't seem to mind. The other option, of course, is horseback. Horse riding is cool. I don't know what else to say. You can pet your horse. Who doesn't love a good horse? Of course, there's an obligatory race mission for both, and they aren't cakewalks, which is nice as I often find race missions in games with driving or horse riding to be incredibly easy to get ahead and hold the lead. Here, the two race missions are far tighter and you're working your way up the leaderboard, if you will. And if there's more challenge and the pressure is on you to win, there is more intensity. Now, Traversal does eat a lot of time moving between points. Fortunately, there's a skip journey option if that's not your thing. I never felt a need to use it though, as the game wasn't long enough for it to start getting dull. There are usually conversations you can miss if you press skip too readily, so I honestly preferred not to use it at all, even when Enzo was in the car alone. You only spend so much time in this world soaking in the environment. I didn't really want to cut it short unnecessarily. Had this been Mafia 3, that button would have been my best friend. If there's one thing that isn't hugely ideal, especially when driving across the map, is the game's noticeable lack of a mini-map. You have to constantly pause the game to refer to the full map. It's a cool map, and it has a little artistic flair of its own, so I don't really mind looking at it. But sometimes pausing the game to consult it while moving at high speeds in a car can take you out of the immersion a bit. On the flip side, I do understand and appreciate why the game doesn't want some invasive visual cue on the road for which roads to take, and why the presence of a minimap eats up screen real estate that would for most of the game be wasted in an on-rail story. But I think one that dynamically popped up while driving or riding a horse alone would have been handy, just so you don't have to continuously pause the game to make note of which roads to take. That's the thing about roads in an ancient country that aren't in an urban setup largely designed around efficient navigation for vehicles. They have to appear as if they've existed somehow for centuries. This means winding paths and no guarantee taking a road will bring you to your objective simply because it's headed in that direction, because they're cutting through a natural landscape. This makes the use of a map handy for not having to continuously pause the game to make sure you're going the correct way. In fact, there's no route established when heading to an objective. You get a location on the pause menu's map and that's it. When driving, all you get is a cue to tell you which general direction you need to take, but when factoring ancient roads woven into the countryside over centuries of use, not necessarily designed for ultimate efficiency, but rather what's been beaten into the land through hundreds of years of simply being the least fuss at the time, roads aren't so direct nor predictable, and perhaps in that a mini-map with a route to follow would have been handy. It's not a massive issue, but it's an element of player convenience I noticed was missing when there were times when it would have been good to have to hand. We could certainly make the immersion breaking counterpoint, but I would also argue the fact that Enzo pays his wardrobe for clothes is also quite immersion breaking, so the game isn't necessarily too strict on that. Now, considering the measured narrative pacing and priority alongside the gameplay matching that, the game is dominated by a lot of transition, so moments where you're actually engaged in the more gripping aspects to the gameplay are quite limited. You'll find a lot of time does get lost in simply moving through the world at an acceptable rate while listening to dialogue or walking between points A and B. The amount of the game that is allocated to action is fairly slim by comparison, but for such a firm narrative focus, I didn't find that to be all too underwhelming. As for customization, there are a lot of options for clothing. We can purchase a new attire from the mysterious unseen vendor in the wardrobe, and that's cool I suppose. It does always help to dress the part. I'd love to know who's in the wardrobe selling us this stuff. Is there like a goblin in there or something? We can also apparently customize hairstyles and beards from a range of options, but the game, despite presenting the idea that you can, never seems to let you actually do it, which is very odd. I'd imagine that's exclusive to free roam. It's either that or my game bugged out. I'd imagine it's probably the former. Overall, Mafia the Old Country has good gameplay. It's ultimately nothing special, nor is it anything short of what it should be as a minimum. I doubt it'll be hailed for its gameplay down the line, as I can't point to any one thing it does that I haven't seen before, but it's beyond serviceable and certainly enjoyable for a story-driven game. Every feature works as intended, and though at first I found controls to be a tad fiddly, it did eventually click and feel natural. As for content beyond the storytelling, there are some content-like bits. There are collectibles, most of which can be found as you go through the story, newspapers to collect, notes to read, documents pertaining to recognisable Mafia characters laying around, basically stuff that enhances the world above all else, adds details. Even if unnecessary, it makes it feel alive. The charms are collectibles. They can be found as statuettes in passing. There are these mysterious fox shrines that giggle when you pick them up. God knows where Enzo puts them. Maybe in the wardrobe with the mysterious shopkeeper he keeps in there. We can also take photographs with a rudimentary camera. It's nothing too huge, nothing too grand, just passing collectibles without becoming a collectathon, so it's respectable. Aside from that, the free roam mode is alright, though I really don't use that sort of thing. Using it blows open the world a bit since its commitment to being lively exists purely so far as it aids the story. Without any story occurrences, the world goes a bit floppy. Beautiful, wonderful to explore everything there is to see, but ultimately quite lifeless and shallow as you're going nowhere in particular. And since this isn't an open world game by genre, it really doesn't offer much aside from an opportunity to bag collectibles you missed. When those collectibles are in specific mission areas, you can always replay those missions from the menu too. It serves a useful function, being that you don't have to do another playthrough to get every collectible if that's your thing, but that's kind of it. Everything else it offers is squarely aimed at appreciating the scenery or just dossing about in a car. As for performance, I played on a base PS5 and I found the visuals didn't cause ridiculous frame drops, and whatever frame rate it achieves, all I ask is it be consistent, so that's good. I can't speak to how the game plays on Xbox, PS5 Pro or indeed PC, but I can't say I noticed an excess of bugs for me. There were some janky moments when the gameplay transitioned to cutscenes and vice versa, and sometimes the world spent a split second unloaded before me when switching between forward and reverse cameras when driving. Otherwise, I was genuinely impressed at how polished this game was for me. The only thing that did jar me a bit was the loading screen sometimes took a bit, and it's basically 3 dots in the corner of the screen. I know accepting loading screens with information besides from just an acknowledgement that something is working in the corner is becoming increasingly less important, with SSDs being the standard, meaning loading times are slashed. But here at times, I felt the loading screens when reloading after having died were just long enough that a little bit of gameplay advice felt like it would have been good company for once. Beyond that, no complaints. In conclusion, Mafia: The Old Country is fantastic. It may not have the most groundbreaking gameplay in the world, but it serves its purpose delightfully, giving comfortable, well-refined gameplay that works well in tandem with its hefty story focus and strong, albeit predictably tragic narrative. The Old Country is beautiful, it leans into its glorious visuals often, and technically holds up quite well from what I've experienced. If you're looking for a 12 to 15 hour whopper that you can enjoy without being overwhelmed by another open world full of benign content and skill trees more expansive than the game itself, at a reasonable price point for a brand new game at that, and you have an appreciation for cinematic storytelling, you really can't go far wrong with this one. Is it a Game of the Year contender? I don't know. I don't play enough new games in any given year to say either way, I don't think. And before anybody asks me for a number rating, I don't tend to give those. On the rare occasion I review a game, if I've learned anything, number ratings are meaningless. And the day games become so samey that an actual criterion could be established for what qualifies for what score to give them any meaning whatsoever, the soul will have officially left the games industry, and I'd be looking for a new hobby. And a new job. What I can say is, Mafia: The Old Country has heart. It accomplishes what it sets out to do, and I enjoyed playing it because it was a good time. I really liked it. I don't necessarily think it's the best in the series, I'm not qualified to make that judgment anyway, and I can't attest to replay value, but I feel adequately satisfied with it after one run. However, if you want a love letter to a time when games weren't competing to be the biggest, grandest open world experiences on the planet, and a few short sittings could see you reach your story's end, a time when games didn't cost an arm and a leg, The Old Country scratches that itch very nicely. So with that, I thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. That would be massively appreciated, of course. To give you an absolute answer, if you're anything like me, I absolutely recommend Mafia: The Old Country. And if you shop around, you'll likely find a good deal somewhere. But look, with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care, and goodbye.